Welcome to Futurenow, Innovfest Unbound. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I trust you are well. Yes, looking forward to this. And it's fabulous that you've joined us for a very special session. My name's Tina Altieri. I'm your moderator. But you know, today, in the next hour, you might want to consider me your CEO. Or maybe your CTP. CEO, of course, meaning Chief Excitement Officer for the next 60 minutes. And CTP might just mean your Chief Thought Provoker. Yes? Let's try it. And to get you in the thinking zone, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to take a quick look around the magnitude of the room today. Take a look. Take a quick look. The volume of the audience. You may not have realised it. You may not have realised it, but in the last 13 minutes since you've been walking through that back entrance and stepped into the session, you stepped into the future of medical science, the future of treatment of diseases, and the future of your health. I want you to imagine this. A loved one has just been faced with a cancer diagnosis. That person has become one of 33 million people globally now facing life with cancer. You accompany your loved one to their first oncology appointment, and the specialist tells you something you did not expect to hear. What you thought you'd be discussing at the very beginning of the appointment is what's usually in the oncologist's toolbox. The possibility of surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, the side effects. But instead, the oncologist is talking gene mutations and our DNA. The oncologist explains that instead of approaching the treatment of the cancer the traditional way, in other words, the site of the origin, whether it's cancer of the liver or cancer of the lung, there is a better way. The patient is about to be treated based on whether they show up with these gene mutations, regardless of the location of the tumour. Special small molecules are able to be used to intervene in the tumour signalling pathways. And this is the paradigm shift. It's called precision medicine, the newest approach to cancer therapy that holds great promise for the future of medicine, holding out hope for more targeted therapies which offer better treatment results and fewer side effects. Now, this innovation tailors the treatment to the specific genes of your loved one, taking into account lifestyle and taking into account environment. The bigger picture now, ladies and gentlemen, is that it presents new opportunities in tackling difficult to treat diseases like cancer with high unmet needs. So, allow me now to introduce our very first guest to help us see some clarity around this medical innovation, this breakthrough that you will be hearing so much more about. From the National University Cancer Institute of Singapore, would you please welcome our first guest, the Director, Professor Chung Wee Ju, ladies and gentlemen. Professor, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tina.
Thank you. Let's take a seat. I want to ask you, and by the way, you will have the opportunity to also ask questions of our panellists a little bit later on. But may I ask you, this precision medicine, is it the Holy Grail? Is this the news we've been waiting for when we talk about cancer treatment?
Well, so Tina, I think to some extent it is, when it is possible to do it very well for every single patient. Because I think we all know that traditionally when someone is sick or you have cancer, you go to see a doctor, and the treatment that is recommended for you is actually our best guess. In many ways, medicine is to some extent still quite empiric because the treatment we recommend is usually something that works well for majority of the patient. But for that individual patient that is sitting in front of us, we have no idea whether it's going to work very well for them and what exactly the kind of side effects we may expect. And to some extent, what is the best dose for that patient as well? Because very often we'll use a dose that has been tested on other patients that seems to be the safest. So I think this is the paradigm of precision medicine, which is actually the way to deliver the right treatment at the right dose for the right patient. So that when I have individual A come into the room, we make a precise diagnosis and we can tell this patient, you have this cancer and this is the treatment, this is the dose, and that you need to have the treatment. Whereas a second patient that come in through the door with the same diagnosis may have a different mutation in the cancer that requires a different treatment, and because of their constitutional makeup, may actually require a different dose from patient A. So I think this is the kind of holy grail that we want to get to, and I think over the years we are getting closer and closer. Certainly for a number of different diseases, it's becoming more feasible now.
Professor, maybe we should ask the audience, can I have a show of hands? Who has heard of precision medicine? Can I have a show of hands?
That's pretty good.
So this is interesting. Professor, you've been around the traps a long time. How long has precision medicine been on your radar? Because clearly, and from what we're hearing from the audience, this is not new science.
That's right. So, for the longest time, we have known about the challenge of medicine, which are this empiric nature. So, we have always been on the search for markers that allow us to stratify patient, that allow us to make therapeutic decision. So certainly, I'm a hematologist, so I treat blood cancers. In the field of blood cancers, we have been using genetic information to stratify patients for treatment, as well as to select specific drugs, for more than 10 years, But the problem with the technology that was available all those years ago was that these are not very precise technology. They make some, rough stratification, but they're not very precise. And also the number of these precision small molecule treatment or targeted therapy, as we call it, the repertoire is very limited. So if the repertoire is limited, then the applicability is also limited to only very few individuals that have those specific mutations. I think what have changed in the last 10 years is a number of things. One is the reduction in the cost of sequencing. It's becoming a lot cheaper to do whole genome type sequencing. And with these advancement in technology, we are able now to identify a whole range of different mutations in the same patient. And parallel to that is a very rapid development of drugs that target a large array of these mutations. So because now we have an expanded armamentarium, an expanded knowledge of what is wrong, we can then start to match treatment to patients in a lot more cases. So I think what have changed is really all these advancements that we've seen in the last 10 years.
You mentioned patients, Professor. Could you tell us what sort of an impact we're seeing on these patients as a result of precision medicine?
I think, the impact is tremendous, in those who have benefited. So just a few examples. So one of the most classic example, that I'm most familiar with is a type of blood cancer called chronic myeloid leukemia. This is a leukemia that used to be treated with stem cell transplant associated with high cost, high toxicity. Sometimes these side effects could be lifelong because of graft versus host disease. But with the advance of precision medicine, because we can detect the mutation that is present in these CML patients, there is now a drug that the patient takes just as a tablet, and essentially the disease is cured with just taking a tablet as opposed to a stem cell transplant. So this is a complete paradigm change in terms of treatment concept as well as quality of life for the patients. In the field of lung cancer is another example. In the old days, lung cancer is almost like a death sentence. You have very short survival. But lung cancer, I would say, is one of the diseases with a very rapidly evolving treatment paradigm that is now based a lot on the use of precision targeted therapy as well as detection of gene mutation in the tumor to decide on the treatment. And this has greatly increased the survival of patients. Not just that, but they're often using very well tolerated drug that is not chemotherapy based. So I think these are some very clear examples that when it's done right, the impact can be tremendous. And so now the challenge is, how do we make these kind of technology and therapeutic, targeted therapy relevant to more and more cancers and more patients.
Professor, if we may, let's invite somebody new to the panel, and let's add another layer to this discussion, ladies and gentlemen, from an innovator's perspective and what's being developed globally that will advance precision medicine to a brand new level. So it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Senior Vice President, Head of Commercial Operations, Bayer Pharmaceuticals Division, Asia Pacific, ladies and gentlemen, Klaus Zieler. Hi Klaus, great to see you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Hello, Professor John.
Klaus, should we be shouting this news about precision medicine from the rooftops? Is it exciting as we're hearing right now?
Oh, absolutely. It's very exciting. I mean, as Professor Chong already explained, the traditional medicines are... I'm getting a little bit of... Thank you. The traditional medicines I mean, chemotherapy, you would typically have a response rate of maybe 20%. Targeted therapy, maybe 40%. Here, response rates of up to 80%, meaning once you've identified the mutation, and you pair that with the tailor-made treatment, 80% of your patients will respond. The tumor will shrink. And I really would just like to show you one example how powerful this medicine is.
Yes, let's take a look. That's it.
So, this is a 2-year-old girl, 2-year-old. Diagnosed with a tumor in her knee. You can see that huge white tumor mass on the photo on the left. Now, she went through 2 cycles of traditional chemotherapy. Chemotherapy did not show any response. Doctors were desperate. Tumor was continuing to grow. They suggested to the parents that the only option would be to amputate the leg to essentially get rid of the tumor. Yeah? Otherwise, there would be risk of metastases and death to the girl. Then she was put on an experimental therapy at the time, which we are now bringing to market, and that is precision medicine. 4 cycles of this Loxo 101, and you can see how that tumor mass has shrunk dramatically. I mean, there's almost nothing left. It's now small enough that you can remove it surgically, and you can remove it without any margins being left. The girl, you can see her on the upper right. She's perfectly fine. She's walking like any normal girl. Essentially, we've saved a girl from losing her leg. I mean, that's how powerful this therapy is. Yeah?
It's an amazing story. Klaus, you've named it for the first time. We've not said the word, but you named it in that it's Loxo.
Yes.
The story of Loxo is quite extraordinary. Tell us how it all started.
So this is Loxo is actually a company in the United States, which we signed an agreement with in November of last year, and now are helping Loxo to bring this therapy through the regulatory processes throughout the world, and then bring it to patients, to doctors, as a new choice for treatment.
So it really is an amazing story that has evolved in a fairly quick amount of time. Would you agree?
Very quickly. Very, very quickly, because it all relies on finding a treatment that you can pair with a specific mutation. Yeah, and Thank you. So, you know, cancer is not one disease. Cancer is hundreds of diseases, depending on different types of mutations that occur over time. So the question is, can we identify treatments that you can pair with each of these mutations? And this is the first time we've done this. So this is the first time you can identify a specific mutation and then take this LOXO 101, Larotrectinib is the scientific name, off the shelf and say, we know this particular compound treats patients with this particular mutation. Now, the mutation can be in any type of cancer. It can be in salivary cancer, it can be in breast cancer. You know, this is not specific to one organ. And that's the paradigm shift that I think we need to think about.
And also, don't you find, Klaus, that you were just saying this is mutation by mutation? This is what you're saying. This is just one. How many are you looking to, ideally, how many do we need to find to make a real impact on cancer therapy?
I don't know, Professor Chong. This must be hundreds, maybe even thousands of different mutations we have to map out one by one. So there's a lot of work that's still ahead of researchers in academia, of companies, and of the regulatory environment that essentially needs to help us find ways that we can bring this to market quickly, because mapping it out one by one is an elaborate, complex process in the end.
Klaus, that's a perfect segue to our next guest who's going to join us on stage, ladies and gentlemen, the startup company that has an important role to play in the innovation process. Would you please welcome centre stage Dr. Nyam Ki Yuan, co-founder of Medilot and Chief Technology Officer of NUHS. Make him welcome. Doctor, we know, of course, through Medilot, you analyse and interpret large medical data sets. How did a company like Medilot create such a powerhouse force that's now an important piece of the precision medicine puzzle?
I think data it's gold today. We have grown this company out of the combination of being at NUS and NUH. That's where the cradle of AI technologies and data come together, because we have the perfect combination of not only very well curated real clinical data together with the technical capabilities of our colleagues in the field of computing. And that's how we started off by building these technologies on rich and huge amounts of data. And to echo some of the panelists' view, precision medicine is about finding that needle in that large haystack, that those variants, those one gene or one set of variants that predict a cancer like that, and you could treat it with a drug like LOXO. I think that's the promise and the belief of precision medicine. And I think having a technology on board to bring it all the way down to translation, i.e. we can now signal doctors and tell them that, look, your patient has a very good chance that they will benefit from this particular therapy. That's where the rubber hits the road, right? When you actually deliver precision medicine to the patient, not on a research basis, but on a clinical basis.
What chance do you think, Doctor, does the increasing digitalisation offer for research, more specifically cancer research?
Well, I think working in cancer research for myself, I'm a surgeon, and we know that the time it takes for the actual surgery to getting the data, to getting the analysis, and to clinical practice has traditionally been a very, very long drawn process. And indeed, along the way, there are a number of clinical and regulatory steps that prevent us from effectively delivering this insight to our doctors that will then help our patients. But I think we are well along the way, given that we have implemented a number of technologies that smooth that pathway. So one of the greatest impediments to research is permissions. How do you deal with patient privacy, at the same time find that balance between giving the patient the chance to participate in a research study, that will allow them to contribute not only to their own health, but the health of others who might have the same disease as they have. And for the longest time, we've not been able to share this data well. I just wanted to share this point about the MIDI technologies. One of the technologies that we are trying to spin off is the blockchain technology that underlies all the data that we collect. And we can build in permissions from day one. So it does not matter whether at day one you've given permissions and day 100, are you going to have the same permission? It's tagged to that patient. So we are utilizing an essential feature of a blockchain to empower permissions and therefore empower the translation of these data into clinical practice.
Certainly with your MediLot hat on, if I could ask you, Doctor, what sort of seat and how important is that seat at the medical table that startups have? What sort of important role?
I think, and I think Viju might agree with me, medicine is one of the hardest places to implement technology, not least because of just the regulatory problems that we face. We also have a very high bar in terms of clinical practice. Most clinicians do not want to practice outside of their clinical remit. So because it's so hard to implement technologies and there's so many barriers, startups like MediLot come in to disrupt that whole pathway and ecosystem. But we have to be careful in the sense that we still must follow the same rules. So for example, in AI technology, the FDA has issued guidance, but they haven't regulated it, for example. So I would say that startups like MediLot will be trailblazers in ensuring that the technology that we implement or want to implement meet the highest standards, not just regulatory, but also in clinical practice. Indeed, we want to exceed those requirements so that in the end, our clinicians are, my colleagues, our clinicians are the ones that need to buy into the technology. It's not just a company saying that, no, we are good. It's the clinicians who say that we believe in this technology, we will use this technology.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'd love to open the floor, ladies and gentlemen, to some questions. Well, here have a couple of roving microphones, and I know that a few of you have some all-important burning questions ready to fire off. William, yes, let's hear from you. William, tell us where you're from.
Oh, hi. Yeah, my name is Will Green, Tigermine, a consultancy that helps science and technology companies to grow around Asia. My question is, I'm curious to what extent Singapore is creating the right policy environment to help promote these innovative therapies. So both from an R&D perspective as well as from a commercialization perspective. In part because we know many of these innovative therapies are expensive to develop and deploy. So I'm talking in terms of reimbursement, I'm talking in terms of making sequencing technologies available, I'm talking in terms of the whole sort of policy landscape. So I'm curious for your respective thoughts, given that you come from slightly different areas of healthcare.
Dr. Ngiam, can we start with you?
Yeah, I think that's a very great question. I'm a firm believer that the business model drives the entire ecosystem, right? Once you've got the business model sorted out at the front end, everything prior to that will be addressed. So just to share with you an example, we want to look at pharmacogenomics. So basically, what are the effects of drugs on certain patients in terms of the efficacy and the risk of side effects. So to drive that step, we really need to sequence these patients to understand what variants they might have, etc., right? But to go backwards, if you extrapolate that sequence data backwards, that can be used both for clinical practice and for research. So when we price the sequencing, we price it so that it doesn't just fulfill a clinical mandate, but it also fulfills a research mandate. And at the back end, the data is then we collect the permissions and we will then be able to share this data with not just clinicians, but with researchers as well. So that's my view on this point.
Professor Chung, can I ask your opinion on that?
Sure. So I think Ngiam is absolutely right. For the medical field, the bar is always very high, and hence regulatory constraints are always there. But I think in the field of precision medicine, there's a lot of interest from the ministry level. There's a national precision medicine group that's been set up to look at implementation and regulatory aspects of this. In terms of approval of novel therapies, if these are traditional treatment like drugs, actually the approval is very simple because it's all based around FDA and European approval. So once you get FDA approval, local approval usually follows soon after that with the submission of a dossier. You don't have to do anything extra. But what is challenging are these very new areas, for example, like cellular immunotherapy. Okay, the audience may be new to this, but these are new classes of targeted therapy that uses immune cells. For those very new areas, then it is a growth process both in terms of the research as well as the regulatory aspect. So I think there has to be better partnership between the private, academic and the regulatory bodies as we develop these new areas so that we can move in parallel rather than in sequential manner, which actually retards the progress of some of these areas. Similar things will be things like AI and the use of physician support tools in terms of deciding on treatment. These are very new areas as well, and I've posed a question to Nyam before, what's the regulatory stand on some of these things? And it's not always very clear, which is why I think dialogue and very early engagement will be very important, because I think certainly from the government perspective, I think they're very interested in these areas as an agent of change to improve on cost effectiveness perhaps, as well as more precise treatment, but they wouldn't know exactly what are the issues if the people who are working on it don't bring it to them. So I think this partnership is very critical right at the early stage actually.
Is that important, Klaus, to you as well from your perspective?
Well, I wanted to get back to Will's question in terms of what is Singapore offering and what can we improve maybe. I think Singapore has a very efficient regulatory system, as Professor Chong already mentioned. 2 years ago we launched an antibiotic, a novel antibiotic. The first country in the world we launched it in was Singapore. Because the process is fast, it's efficient, it's reliable. So that's very good. I also think what Singapore is building in terms of the electronic medical records in the hospitals and linking those between different hospitals is a very good initiative. It's a bit slow because we have to connect different IT systems, but the direction is the right direction. And I think once that's available, we'll have a very rich data source of clinically relevant data from patients in the Singapore hospital. And I understand that we will be able in industry to access that on an anonymized basis, so it also caters to the data privacy that Yong was mentioning. I think precision medicine probably needs one extra step, and that is how do we identify the mutations? We don't do that today routinely. When you go for cancer for a diagnosis, you will have a clinical exam, you will be identified with a mass in one of your organs, you will maybe have an X-ray or an MRI, maybe a biopsy, we will look at cells. All that is in the classical cascade of what a hospital would do. But genetic testing is not in that cascade. And we need to work together with the medical system, and that's not only the medical community as treaters, but also the payers, to make sure that the right tests are inserted. Because if we don't identify the mutation, then we will never be able to apply the right treatment. And these are rare mutations, so you will not, off the top of your head, think of, oh, I need to test for this mutation. And I think that thinking has to come into guidelines and has to come into routines in medical practice and in the systems, in the national systems across the world. So I think that is something where, again, if Singapore were at the forefront, it could show the way to other nations which maybe will not be as fast in adopting that kind of genetic testing in diagnosis.
Indeed. Please.
Just want to add that actually, because the questioner was asked on the issue of reimbursement. approval and reimbursement in Singapore is actually two separate things. So actually, in terms of genetic testing, like for lung cancer, as I said, is now very much driven by targeted therapy and genomics. A lot of our patients will get the genetic mutation done through foundation medicine. So, the samples are sent. But here, the tests have to be paid for fully by the patient. So in Singapore, the reimbursement issue requires two conditions, actually, predominant conditions. One is an adoption and agreement by the professional body that this is in the guidelines, this is the right thing to do medically. And then after that, a demonstration of some cost effectiveness. And now Singapore have an agency of for care evaluation that has been formulated to look at that. And that will then decide whether the government will provide some reimbursement for some treatments or tests. So, and they will not look at these things unless the professionals themselves agree that this is the way to go. And the agreement on that is usually based on solid data from clinical trials and clinical studies. So there is a process to these things. And I think Singapore has a very well-developed process that is, very good. But it's just that it's not a free-for-all in that sense. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that terrific question. Can we ask any further questions from the floor before we move on? We've got a roving microphone. Please raise your hand. Okay, let's move on if there are no questions on the floor. Let me just ask you, if I may, Professor, surely there are gaps and limitations to precision medicine. So what's stopping it from being the huge success that everyone should be knowing about?
I think, to me, the main constraints, there are many constraints still. Don't get me wrong, it's a very exciting area, and I think people should continue to look at solutions to find more drugs, more targets that will help patients. But I think there lies part of the problem is that there may be too many targets and there may be too many drugs that we need to find to help solve the entire cancer conundrum. The thing is that human biology and cancer biology is still, I think at this stage, much more complex than we think it is. So for example, why is this drug, if it is developed to target the TRK mutation, not effective in 100% of the cases? Why only in 80% of the cases? It's because in the 20% of the cases, although they have the same mutation, they have something else that's going on. And what is this something else? At the moment, we don't know. And so, we need to somehow have a mechanism or complementary test that can deconvolute some of these complexity for us, that can, in combination, better increase the prediction of response to treatment. And I think this is still a process. We're on this journey where we are unraveling, maybe peeling off the first layer of the onion, right? But we need to keep peeling away before we reach the core. And I think with the parallel advancement of technology, with AI and so on, we are better poised than ever to make this journey shorter. And I think so these are some of the constraints actually, that is the understanding of the biology, is to look at not just one drug and one mutation, but sometimes the combination of drugs with a combination of mutations, and understanding that this drug may not just target one mutation, but other mutations or pathways where different mutations actually converge on. So I think, this kind of thinking process is important. And also using parallel technology and using information beyond just genetics may also help. And I think all these are different fronts in this war against cancer, so to speak, that is moving in parallel. And at some point, they will all converge and be able to be combined to give us a better handle on how to treat more patients, with these precision medicine tools. That's my thoughts on this.
And maybe I can just take the opportunity to make you aware. At noon, we're launching a program here at InnoFest, which is called From Molecules to Medicine, which actually teaches you all the complexities that a molecule needs to go through to reach the doctor's hand and the patient. So from laboratory bench to patient bedside. So it's launched at noon today here at InnoFest. So please do attend. You can download it on your iPad. It's an interactive program. It's quite fun. There are some prizes. So good edutainment for all of you.
Absolutely. Can you add to that, Dr. Nguyen, also to what Professor Chung was saying about those gaps? Do we all, I must say, when you mention that, Professor, all eyes then go to you, Dr. Nguyen, and say, so what can you do? What are you doing about this? How are you helping to fill those gaps?
I'm not sure if I can fill all the gaps, but at least can attempt at it. Let's just take an assumption, right? Basically, all biological systems, as Prof. Chung and cancer is one of them, are complex. They are multifactorial. And a lot of it is not very deterministic. That's why we are doctors, right? We practice the art of medicine because there's some uncertainty at the very end. So one of the things that having big data and AI is able to do is to be able to collect all this data. And I would just say 5 years ago, we didn't have the methods and the computing power to process all this information. But now we do. I mean, with the advent of GPU, which is a graphical processing units, that are widely available, fairly cheap, relatively cheap compared to when they were launched. Add to that large, huge electronic databases that go back 10, 20 years with, when we used to do projects, we talk about 30, 40 fields of data, like age, gender, etc. Now we're talking 300, 500 fields easily, okay, of data. And within each field, it will be high dimensional. You could have more than 4 or 5 different variates within each field. When you reach that level of complexity, you need tools that are able to model all that complexity into one. So the current way of doing it is to use something called deep learning. So these are neural networks to model these very complex interactions between all the different variables and identify certain variates that may be singly or in combination result in a particular outcome. So that's our attempt to fill that gap. But that's it. We are not all seeing and all powerful because we are very limited by the amount of the kind and the quality of the data you feed into the machine. That's the first thing. And the second is how you curate this data. That's very, very important. There's a very good phrase everybody knows is rubbish in and rubbish out, right? You feed the machine with very dirty data that's not appropriate, you're going to get trash on the other end. So we spend a lot of time curating this data, making sure that the data that goes into these machines represents either a physical reality or a biological reality. So just as an example, when we look at diagnoses, we don't just look at diagnoses from A to Z. We curate them in terms of severity. And severity is a difficult one because severity is a very arbitrary term, right? I mean, what is severe to you may not be severe to another person. Or is it severe in terms of cost? Is it going to cost a lot? Or is it severe because it has a lot of morbidity to the patient? So we have that kind of dictionaries that help us curate this data so that at the end of it, the solution that comes out makes sense. And we're taking baby steps towards solving some of these problems, filling in the biological gaps. And I think Prof. Chung didn't mention some of the other biological gaps that we haven't talked about, like epigenetics, right? What happens beyond just DNA variants? You can epigenetics that influence that as well. So I think, but the more data we get, the better we are at predicting such things. And many of the things that we're doing today are first steps towards that process of finding out what is the real underlying drivers of disease, for example.
Well put, well put. And indeed, everything that you've just mentioned points to one big word that we've not spoken enough about in this session, and that is partnerships. Klaus, partnerships play an important role, certainly in your line at Bayer, don't they? How vital are they?
I think partnerships are essential. I don't think anyone today, not one company, not one individual, not one institution, can innovate alone. you need different pieces of the puzzle to come together. And we've moved at Bayer from in-house laboratory alone to an open collaboration system already 10 years ago. And specifically in Singapore, we've established very, very solid relationships with academic centers where we put our heads together, where we even launch projects to collect data from patients all across Asia. We have, for instance, a project ongoing in heart failure, which literally collects patient data from 6,000 patients from Korea, Taiwan, all across the Asian countries. Now, with those data sets, you get to what you were discussing, which is how can we now analyze the data? How can we mine that data? We as a company would never have been able to access that data because we cannot access individual patient data. But academic centers can do that. Yeah? And we can then work with the anonymized data, and we can help with our know-how to say, aha, if we now understand mechanisms better, based on that data, maybe we can then invent a medicine that helps in those conditions. So without that collaboration of academic centers, industry, and I would also include government institutions, because the government sets the policies, and we need to work together to gain an understanding together in these complex questions, that we set the right policies and then we get the right know-how to work together to develop solutions. As you said, 33 million people across the world suffer from cancer today. That's a population about the size of Malaysia. Yeah? In 2030, that's estimated to be more than 50 million people. That's as much as Taiwan and Australia put together. Yeah? These people need solutions, and we want to bring them solutions, but we need the environment and we need the partners to be able to do that. So collaborations are essential.
On that point, Professor Chung, if I could ask you, ultimately to elevate precision medicine to the next level, if there was a priority, and I know that there are many for you, but if there was a priority, what do we need to do now in order to be able to elevate this to the next level?
I think it is still, I think there are two layers. So one is really the access for the patient. I think a lot of these precision medicine initiatives are benefiting a lot in countries where the drugs and genetic testing are fully reimbursed. They get the full benefit of this. In countries like Singapore, and other Asian countries where it's a kind of self-pay system, it remains a challenge because the truth is that the test and the drugs are quite expensive. So I think on one level is finding a solution, and this could be industry, government partnership, to make these drugs and assays more accessible to the patient. I think would be something that, from a local perspective will be important to have an impact, because it could be, if you go and survey the patients that are in Singapore with cancer, how many of them are benefiting from precision medicine? It could be a low percentage, because although the potential numbers could be higher, but the ones who actually could afford it may be low. So I think that's one aspect. The other important aspect, which is more global, is that we need to have better ways to understand this biology. And I suspect that it may not all reside with just the genetic information. There are now mechanisms where you can shortcut these genetic testing by testing the tumor itself, either in animal models, we call avatar mouse models, or in a petri dish, that you grow the patient's tumor cells direct from the biopsy, and you test combinations of drugs that are already approved and available for use. And we have adopted in patients where they don't have any more good treatment available to them, using these technologies, and we have actually seen remarkable response to drugs that we don't normally use to treat that cancer, but the model system actually predict. So I think these could be, I think we need to start to think a bit outside of the box, work a bit more with, AI, some of the non-traditional areas, looking at working with people of the engineering background to create, assays that are amenable to clinical application, look at working with other people to come up with the materials to grow these cells a bit better. We need to really have a more comprehensive approach beyond the traditional field of just genomics and drug development. I think that would be an important next frontier to actually go for.
You mentioned AI, Dr. Nyam. I think, what about you in terms of the next frontier from a technological point of view? What do you see it as? What can we anticipate?
Okay, so I think we can encapsulate technology implementation in this area into 3 words, right? So there's permissions. So we talk about sharing patients' data. That's always been a big problem, and with GDPR and Singapore's PDPA laws in action, we need to have a way to solve this issue of permissions, how we share data. The second area is platform. So you need a platform in which you put all this data, and this platform has to be secure, it has to be equitable. People can't take the data out and run away with it and that kind of thing. And the third is practice, really. So you can do all this wonderful work, but there's no way to have a practice to deliver that insight to the patient. So just to address these 3 issues together, one of the things that the Medilot does is to provide that platform. Because like I explained earlier, is that we have a blockchain-based technology. So when the patient data comes into the platform, it is anonymized at source. Once it goes into the data, it's secure and there's provenance, so you know where the data is. Within the platform itself, at NUH, the platform's called Discovery AI, we will be able to link up patients' data anonymously to each other. And finally, when we run the AI tools on these patients' data, we can then deliver the insight to the patient directly through the EMR system. So that's, when you talk about partnerships, what we really want is for every piece along that way to have people help us. So I couldn't do the blockchain technology myself. I looked to my technical colleagues to help me with that technology. I couldn't do the genomic sequencing myself. I looked to the scientists to help me do the genomic sequencing. I looked to companies like Bayer to collaborate with us to say that, okay, these are the variants we are interested in. Your molecular mechanism pathways, okay, we'd be very interested to match those to our patients who have disease, for example. And finally, once you've validated all these AI tools or particular molecules, we want to be able to deliver that to our patient. So in summary, really, to implement technology, you need permissions, platforms, and practice to be able to deliver the whole suite to the patient.
Yes. Klaus, certainly from Bayer's perspective, it has an important role too, and what it contributes to elevating precision medicine going forward.
Yes, I mean, if you think about drug development, the first step is inventing the molecule. The other 10 years are spent on gathering information about the molecule. What does it do in the body? What effects? What side effects? Safety, dissolution profile. It's all information. Information can be stored on paper or it can be stored electronically. Once it's electronic, you can mine it much more efficiently than we used to be doing in the past. Yeah? So I think the world is moving towards connecting different sources of information. And to your point, if the information is not on the same platform or if it's not cleaned properly, then you're not going to get more than just a bunch of noise, and you can't predict anything. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into getting standardized platforms. In essence, to Will's question, that is the problem that Singapore hospitals are struggling with in terms of electronic medical data records for patients, because every hospital has a different system right now. Now, in order to connect that into one database, you need standards. You need to standardize those fields of data so they mean the same thing, once you look at them in one big pool. The same is true for clinical trials and everything that we do in research and development, in academic centers, in startup companies. If we don't have the same data standards, we're not going to be able to get very far in terms of mining that data for useful purpose. Yeah? So I really think we're at the verge of a revolution, but it's only just started. Yeah? And we're an inventor company at Bayer. That's our job. We invent things. And then we document these things. But that we're now in a world where we have to insert processes like sequencing in order to get the data, to then match the data with a treatment, that is also new for us. So the world will have to learn how to deal with those elements to create an efficient system of identifying the patient with the right mutation to get that treatment to the patient. So if we don't apply the treatment, we can't help the patient. I mean, that's been the wonderful success of this 2-year-old girl, that a doctor actually thought of applying something completely new, and it worked. Yeah, it worked fabulously. But how do we make that routine in life? I think that's a big challenge across medical practice across the world. Yeah.
Indeed, still a lot of work to do. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed those incredible new insights. What you've heard is information that really is brand new that you're working on, and what a wonderful opportunity for our special guests to share it with you and indeed with all of us today. Would you please thank Dr. Nyam, Klaus Zieler as well. Thank you very much also from Bayer. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Professor Chung. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for those new insights. Thanks for that great information. I hope you obtained a lot from that, ladies and gentlemen. Just a reminder that at 12 o'clock, we'd love you to join us to learn a little bit more that takes you from molecules to medicine, so you can actually follow the journey in a very interactive way with a great experiential game that gives you an insight into how we move through the therapy process as well. So please do join us out there at 12 noon. Thank you very much for joining us. Its time is up. We look forward to the rest of the day. Innofest Unbound. Thank you very much, everyone. See you soon.